Welcome. My name is Dr. Barry Prezant, and thank you for joining our podcast. It's a very exciting time for us to introduce the world to the Uniquely Human podcast and discussion. And I'd like to bring in Dave Finch, who is a New York Times bestselling author and a wonderful technician in terms of the magic behind the curtain in making these podcasts happen. So Dave, it is a pleasure to have you with me.
It's a huge pleasure to join you because I'm a big fan, obviously, of the book. I remember the first time I read the book was on an airplane, and I thought, finally, this guy gets it. I've not only been enjoying being behind the curtain of creating this podcast series, but very few people know this about me. I am a master seamstress, and I was also sewing the curtains that I was hiding behind. So, no, it's really fun to be here, and I'm just really excited to be able to share more about Uniquely Human through your eyes with the audience, because I feel like a lot of us read the book and wish we had more. So this is the more.
Yes, and we are looking forward to progressing on our journey together, hand in hand, mind in mind, with good wit and some wonderful, important information that we think everybody will benefit from.
Absolutely.
And I want to start just by saying, who knew? Who knew that Uniquely Human would be embraced by so many people, would reach so many people around the world? It was intended to be a book of stories about what I learned from children and adults on the spectrum and their parents. And I do want to say it's an absolute pleasure to be with you. If people have not read your book, The Journal of Best Practices, they must read it. We first met in person when I saw you presenting with your wife, Kristen. And not only did you touch upon so many essential points, but with incredible humor, wit, and tips that could help any marriage. So it is an honor and pleasure to be with you, Dave.
Thank you. And when you say who knew this would be a successful book, I submit that I knew. And I knew it because we were talking at that same conference. It was in San Diego, the Love and Autism conference. And I remember, when I go and do speaking engagements, I just sign contracts. Like they'll send me, we expect you there on September 19th. Okay, great. So then they want to make it official and they send a contract. So I scribble my name, I take a picture of it and I send it back and say, there's your contract. I really don't pay attention to things until I get there, and then I figure out what it is I'm supposed to do. So normally I don't know what I'm going to say until the person is introducing me, because I'm trying to figure out what the vibe of the conference is. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not exactly winging it, but I'm definitely improvising. But I was on the plane and I was telling Kristen who we were going to be, at the conference with. And I said, everybody's making a real big deal about this one guy. So I bought his book, and who is it? It's this guy, Dr. Barry something. She goes, Barry Prezant? Yeah, that's it. Barry Prezant. That's right. He wrote this book, Uniquely Human. And she lost her mind because she was formerly a speech language pathologist. In fact, she's got all the same credentials after her name as you do, except for the PhD. She's got MS, CCC, SLP, blah, 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 blah. She's got like 15 letters after her name. Mm-hmm. And your work prior to writing Uniquely Human, you were one of the first people who had this philosophy about the autistic mind and the autistic experience that rang true for her. That was not one of pathology. And I said, well, I've got his book right here. Maybe I should thumb through it. And so I started reading this thing on the plane on the way there. And I'll tell you, from the first page, you had me, because when people read my book, if they're on the spectrum, they say, oh my gosh, I saw a lot of myself in your book. It's very rare for someone with autism to read a body of work or a book like this coming from somebody who wouldn't carry the same diagnosis. And for me to see myself in your work was really powerful for me. So thank you so much for writing the book. I think it's amazing. And I'm actually going to dwell on that a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about the book in this first episode, but this is one episode of many, because there's so much that you and I can talk about. But let me ask you, what is it that you wanted to get out of doing a podcast? What inspired you to do this?
Yes, well, so many people have been in touch with me since Uniquely Human was published. And of course, I kind of spent a lot of my career, and still do, in academia. So these were people who I would not reach otherwise. Now, of course, I've always remained very active consulting to schools and spending time with families, and I'm involved in some theater projects, the Miracle Project in particular, and the Spectrum Theater Ensemble. But people started contacting me and sharing stories from my book and how much they've learned sometimes from those individual stories. And this just continued to develop and increase over the 5 years. I can't believe the book was published 5 years ago. And one of the messages I received constantly is, okay, what's next? We want more. That hearing stories about kids and adults of all abilities in all situations seemed to connect with people, where they started thinking about their own children, their own students. But I always heard, we want more. And the other thing that's been incredibly both validating and humbling is that it's become a very popular, Uniquely Human's become a very popular topic at conferences for kind of keynote addresses or for introductions to the conference. And then again, people always come up to me afterwards and say, well, what's next? And a few people who I really trust said to me that, you know, Barry, you're able to kind of share very spontaneously what you've learned with some enthusiasm, and we could connect to that. So instead of just writing, why don't you talk? And so, to be quite honest, I've been tossing around the idea of a podcast for a couple of years, and I never kind of found myself with the right person in the right situation to say, you know, this could be done well, this could be done professionally, because as far as the technology side of doing a podcast, you know, I'm a newborn. I just have no experience. And then just by coincidence, and we had known each other, and I would like to add that one of the most unique bits of feedback that I ever got was a phone call from you, Dave, as we were working together around the development of a center that never really played out the way we wished it would. Yep. And you gave me a call and you said, is this Dr. Barry Prezant? And I said, yeah. and he said, well, you don't know me, but I love you. And I said, oh, this is interesting. I'm just going to let this guy talk. And then you shared what you shared just a few minutes ago, that as a person on the spectrum, Uniquely Human connected with you in a very special way.
Yeah.
And that became the beginning of our friendship. And then we got to be at conferences, and of course I read your book, and here we are.
This does sound like something I'd say. Well, the podcast is going to be an exciting thing for me personally, and I think for a lot of people, and I'll tell you why. I think that your body of work and your professional career, which has spanned 4 decades.
Yes, actually, I'm in if you count my summer camp experience with individuals with various quote unquote disabilities, I'm in my 50th year right now.
Oh my gosh. Accessing that wisdom and that degree of just professional dedication, we have only about 1 billion topics that we can cover together. What are some of the things that you're excited about for this podcast?
Yes, well, and to take a quick step back, another reason that I wanted to do the podcast is Uniquely Human was written with the great support, I need to say, of Tom Fields-Meyer, who is a professional writer and the father of a wonderful adult son on the spectrum. And the reason that it's also important to do this podcast now is things have changed dramatically since Uniquely Human was written. I mean, that's, as far as the writing, that's 7 years ago. And we are in this tsunami of change, and a part of that is captured in the term neurodiversity. That, uniquely human is one cog in the wheel of so many different forces that are moving us finally in the right direction of understanding people on the spectrum, the autistic experience, society's reaction to people on the spectrum, right or wrong, because one of the greatest areas of difficulty for autistic people and their families has been how people who are ignorant about autism react to people on the spectrum and react to parents as well. So there are so many topics, as you said. We want to talk about, if we look at the term uniquely human, what does that really offer to us as one cog in the wheel of the neurodiversity movement and what we refer to as the autism revolution, shattering so many myths about autism? Of course, we're not about sugarcoating autism, so we want to talk about the challenges. And of course, autism and the experience of autism is a shared human experience.
Yes.
And what that means is families change in ways that are challenging as well as ways that are very positive. Of course, we want to talk about educational programming and treatment issues as well, because hopefully many of the folks who are listening are in positions to work in educational, clinical, different kinds of settings where their life's work has to do with supporting people on the spectrum and their families.
Right.
We are constantly hearing about creative, out-of-the-box innovations.
Right.
Some of them, we shake our heads back and forth and say, oh my God, now this, okay? But other innovations that sometimes in the past people have said, well, I'm not sure that's going to be effective in helping this person on the spectrum or helping this family, are proven to be effective. So we're going to talk about the pros and the cons of kind of the out-of-the-box innovations and the claims and the ethical issues around the claims that go along with that. And then finally, what this is all about is quality of life. If you are an autistic person, if you are a parent, if you're a grandparent, if you're a teacher, if you're a therapist, the one thing we could say is that when we distill down everything we're doing in our lives and in our relationships with people with autism, it's to improve quality of life, not just for them, because if an autistic person, meets their passion in a wonderful employment situation, or an autistic child makes friends at school and the parents develop trust in the school setting and sees their child in a community that values their child, all of this has to do with quality of life. So we should all be on the same page in doing whatever we could do to improve the quality of life for people on the spectrum, because that then improves the quality of life for all of us in relationship with people on the spectrum.
The quality of life for an individual on the spectrum is largely a function of the quality of understanding that the people in their sphere have about the condition and about the experiences. And the reason why I say your line on this and your insights are so unique, you have, for your entire career, have always sought to understand why from the individual's perspective. So let's unpack that a little bit. It's funny. I was talking to an autistic listen, okay, before I go any further, by the way, in this first episode, I want to make something very clear. Person first, identity first, person with autism or autistic person. There are a lot of people who have very strong, solid opinions about which is the correct way to represent the situation. And it's not context specific. It's just that's what they believe. And the problem with having a conversation where you're referencing people with autism / autistic people is that nobody's wrong. So I'm just going to put it out there right now. I use both. I don't know, Barry, if you have, if you say it one way or the other, I'm probably going to get it wrong. And I'm hoping that I'm not alienating people because my respect is exactly the same for everybody across the board.
And I'll just add that my trajectory certainly has been that now I use so-called identity first language much more regularly, but I still find that I will say person or child with autism, but that doesn't mean I'm denying the identity of that person as a person on the spectrum. And just a little anecdote in terms of how things have changed over the years. If you look at my master's thesis and doctoral dissertation from the 70s, I used identity first language. I said autistic child, autistic person. But then we were told that that is disrespectful, and journals required person first language. And now we're kind of shifting back again. But like Dave, you may hear me using both, but it is not in any way a statement of denying your identity, if you are an autistic person, your identity as a person on the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think anybody who knows you understands that you're the last person who would deny somebody their identity, deny somebody their own personal comfort. But we've got a pretty big audience, and like I said, half of the audience is going to be offended half the time, and vice versa. So we'll just do our best with that. But anyway, getting back to what I was saying. I know. If we look at the 40, 50 years you've been doing this, not to say Uniquely Human is a culmination of that, but if that is one of the peaks on the range, where did you start? What was your foothills, and what got you to the Uniquely Human perspective?
It was literally just being out there with kids on the spectrum and adults, and living with them in these summer camp situations, because these were not day camps. These were residential summer camps where I was responsible for the well-being and the happiness and the safety of children and adults who in many cases, because we're talking about the late 60s, early 70s, in many cases, they did not have a good quality of life in their everyday settings, in the schools or the institutions that they were served in. But if they were privileged enough, and in some cases, to tell you the truth, I don't know how the campers, and I'm saying that as a global term because they were adults and children, but I don't know how the campers got to us. I just know they came from a wide variety of settings. Right. But I do know they loved being at camp, and I do know that myself and my colleagues were responsible for making sure they loved being at camp and that they felt safe. Okay.
And that they felt safe.
Yes. Safety and security is huge. We actually touch upon that in Uniquely Human, where we talk about if you can't trust other people and you can't trust the world and you don't feel safe and secure, how can you grow as an evolving human being? How can you progress? So that's the bottom line right there. But yeah, it goes way back to living the story of children and adults, because I lived the story with them way back when, and I saw how different they were from each other as well. And this was crucial for me. That was before I started reading any technical literature on autism. I was not an undergraduate major in special ed or speech language pathology. I was an undergraduate major in, ready for this? Psycholinguistics, which was the study, and it was a burgeoning field at that time, was the study of the relationship between thought and language. And here I was immersed in living with people, all of whom had significant challenges in communicating their emotions, their observations, and their thoughts. So I became kind of an anthropologist, if you will, in this setting with a background in language development and thought, cognitive development, social development, and language. But I had not yet read the literature on people with disabilities or autism yet. So I began to develop my own theories. And then when I began to read that literature, oh my God. I mean, we are talking about the era, the fringe end of refrigerator mother theory, that bad parenting caused autism. It was pretty well being discarded at that point, but I was still exposed to it. Yeah. And American behaviorism, in particular, Dr. Lovaas. And we're not going to dig into that now. But basically what I was reading from what some people refer to as a radical behavioral perspective was that in essence, these kids weren't human beings, that these kids were derailed in their development, and they demonstrated a bunch of quirky, dangerous, socially undesirable behaviors that we needed to get rid of to be effective in treatment. So let me just leave it at that point right now.
We'll put a pin in that.
Yeah. I was exposed to learning directly from adults and people on the spectrum and with other labeled disabilities before I literally crashed into the most prominent literature that was considered to be the most valid literature in explaining what autism was and how to treat it. And the discrepancy could not have been more pronounced and profound. So I was reading a lot of that literature and I said, no, I don't see this. No, this is crazy. I don't see this. But I felt I could feel that and say that because I was steeped in the study of child development.
Steeped in the study of child development, but there's something about your character. There are a lot of people who have an opinion. Then they go off to school. They put the IV drip of prior research and academia into their vein, and they just say, well, that's what I believe now, too. It takes a lot of stones and backbone to look at an entire field of research and to essentially call BS on it. And that's exactly what you were able to do starting from a very young age.
Yeah, and I guess that comes from two distinct sources. The first one was I kind of saw myself as a pseudo hippie, and that
Wait, is a pseudo hippie one that lives the hippie lifestyle but takes showers, or like what's?
Well, in a way, yes. Yeah, I mean, okay. I did not live on a commune in Arizona called the Pig Farm. Okay, nope. I grew up in the streets of Brooklyn.
Yeah.
But I played in a rock band. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I was growing up in New York City and playing in a rock band. I was exposed to various substances at the time.
Absolutely.
And we saw ourselves as being different and gently, at least for my colleagues and my crew, gently challenging authority.
Sure.
And I went to a very liberal university where we closed down the university twice in 4 years due to Cambodia and Vietnam. So my politics were very, very left, and it had to do with challenging authority. So the other piece of it is underlying all of that. I grew up in Brooklyn. And when you grow up in Brooklyn, as they say, you can take the kid out of Brooklyn, but you can't take Brooklyn out of the kid.
That's right.
So, as we like to say, don't mess with us. If I'm gonna read something that I don't believe in and I think it's harmful or disrespectful, I'm gonna call you on it.
Yeah.
So I felt comfortable doing that. Yes.
I love that because there aren't enough people. I would say that. Oh, hang on a second. I'm gonna decline this. I've got some people trying to deliver a dumpster to my house.
I hope the podcast is not going to end up in there.
Oh, it's a big one, Barry. Plowing forward here. You've been dealing with the notion of autism as a pathology. You've been on a quest, I would say, to depathologize autism. Is that part of the uniquely human perspective?
It is a huge part of the uniquely human perspective. And let me just give you a case in point, a subject very dear to me because it was my doctoral dissertation. Mm-hmm. So I entered the field, again, with a background in language and language development, and then working with children who repeated speech a lot. They were echolalic. Sometimes they repeated things immediately, want to go out. Sometimes they repeated things that were said at a previous time, which people refer to as scripting. We refer to it as delayed echolalia, as other people did. So at the time, the literature said this is psychotic speech. This is meaningless parroting. We must either ignore it.
Psychotic and meaningless was the definition of the day?
Those are direct quotes. Psychotic speech and meaningless parroting.
Good God.
Oh, yeah. And having been with kids who were echolalic and having been trained to be an astute observer of language and the functions of language and what's called communicative intent analysis, I said, no, that's wrong. Yeah, sometimes the kids are not understanding what they're saying, but sometimes they're saying yes when they say, for example, if you say, want to play ball? They go, want to play ball? And they're reaching for the ball. I give many examples. I went to the parents and I said, your child repeats speech quite a bit. It's called echolalia. Why do you think he does that? Almost all the parents gave all these reasons. Well, sometimes he says it to himself to process the language better. So it's almost like he needs to keep it in his mind to be able to process that language. Sometimes he says it to request. Sometimes he says it to say yes. Oh, he will echo things to point things out to me, which we call commenting.
Okay.
And this began to validate what I was observing. The literature and the research said pathology. Echolalia is pathology. It's something that is a symptom of autism, something that is terribly wrong and makes a kid autistic. It's part of the definition. Okay? And I'm saying, whoa, I need to study this because I see it anecdotally. I need to study it. So I videotaped 4 children over a year at home, in school, many different situations, analyzed over 1,009 immediate echoes. Nonverbal behavior, what they were saying, how they changed what people were saying. And we came up with 7 different functions of echolalia, which directly was in contrast to the behavioral view of echolalia at that time. In fact, the behavioral view that was popularized by what some people feel was the father of ABA, Lovaas. Okay, Ivar Lovaas. Mm-hmm. So that's just one example. We can go on and on and on about patterns of behavior, flapping, jumping, spinning, even self-injurious behavior, which is a terrible thing when it happens. But it's a child's expression of frustration and anxiety and distress. It isn't an autistic behavior that you just try to condition out of a kid. So the whole notion of depathologizing has to do with let's understand the intention, maybe the neurological reasons why the child engages in that behavior, and then let's try to start with that big why, as we mentioned. What is the why of that behavior? And then provide appropriate support or changes in our behavior or in the environment. So we're viewing the child as an evolving human being where some things get derailed, but it's not just about stopping those behavioral patterns. It's about understanding them first, and in many cases, working with them.
Yep. And this requires an ability to look at the entire person, the whole construct of the person, not just the behavior.
The tough thing to do is to try to understand from the child's perspective. And I'm not just talking about from his perspective in his mind, but also from the child's neurological differences. Why is the child engaging in this behavior? Okay? So if a child is in a busy environment and the teacher says to him, you need to sit down and work, and he starts covering his ears and screaming, the pathologizing would be, oh, he's being non-compliant. That's what autistic kids do. They don't comply when you request. The depathologizing would be, wow, this is such a noisy, overwhelming environment for this child, and now we're placing an additional demand on top of the child. Is it that we have crashed through that threshold of tolerance for him, and he's just saying, I just can't stand it anymore?
Why don't, it seems so simple when you say it, but even as somebody on the spectrum, if one of my own kids had an autism diagnosis, I guarantee there would be plenty of moments where I would look at it and say, like, that's not the behavior that I want. We got to fix this. Why don't more of us, and especially professionals, maybe listen to the parent? Do parents and advocates of individuals on the spectrum almost need to give themselves permission to believe that what they're observing is true and to be able to express it that way? Is it like, how can we bridge that gap between what is the popular opinion of pathologizing and the uniquely human perspective, which is very much based in strengths and just rational understanding.
Yeah. And in some cases, it's giving people permission to think that way. So one of the most gratifying bits of feedback I get from parents after they read Uniquely Human is that so much of what I was told about my child, like, well, when he rocks a lot, that's autistic behavior. Okay, when he echoes, that's autistic behavior. So much of what I've been told about my child violated my instincts and my beliefs of who my child was and why he did these things.
Mm-hmm.
And now with Uniquely Human, Barry is saying, in many cases, you should trust your intuition and your instincts about your child. You shouldn't allow a professional to always say, no, you have to stop that behavior. Okay?
Right.
Or no, he shouldn't be doing this. And then following a behavior plan to stop it, when in the parent's gut, they're feeling very uncomfortable because they're saying, when he jumps up and down and flaps, I think he kind of looks cute. I don't want him to say, quiet hands, quiet body. I don't want to have to say that to him.
Right.
So it's the whole issue of some people very naturally, some parents and professionals will very naturally follow their instincts. Some will feel like, well, I don't agree with what I'm being told, but that person's the expert and I guess I should do that. And then there are other people who feel, it bothers the hell out of me that he does that, so I want to stop it. And I'm not going to even ask why.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's okay. That's okay too. I mean, there are some times where you just have to say, listen, my parents were not autistic as far as I know. I don't know. But they didn't play games and they had a unique kiddo on their hands with me. And they just said, this is how you act. This is how you don't act.
Yes.
And I knew like, all right, those are the rules. But you just I think you just hit a word that made all of this sort of crystallize for me and make a lot of sense. Expert. I think a lot of us say, well, I'm not an autism expert. I just have a child with autism. Or I'm not an autism expert. I just got my diagnosis and I'm 17 years old, right? What do I know? I need the world to tell me about me or about my child. And I think giving license to parents and professionals to understand that by virtue of the fact that they are the parent, they are an expert, maybe not in autism with a capital A, but their child's autism.
Yes. And that's exactly how I think about that.
Yeah.
You may not be an expert on autism, even though many parents become more expert than the experts.
Right.
But you are an expert about your child. One of the common questions that I get is this 3-year-old behavior or is this my child's autism? Is this 12-year-old behavior or is this my child's autism? And my response to that is, I think the most useful and helpful way is to think of every person as an evolving human being, that we all go through challenges and stages of, being stubborn, self-determined. All kids do that. And the autism exacerbates some of that in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to understand every person is evolving, changing, going through shifts in development. And autism makes it more difficult to navigate through those steps. But the positive side is autism often results in very unique abilities and talents that a person of the same age who's not autistic may not have to the same degree.
That's exactly right. And I think there are a lot of employers who are understanding that, hey, if we look at this through a different lens, we're looking actually at a workforce that is highly valuable to us. I'm thinking tech companies, finance companies. There's a great organization here in Colorado, Blue Star Recyclers. It's a technology recycling thing for the individuals with autism who are more inclined for a more of a labor track where they just want to work with their hands, right? And they don't want to be sitting at a desk. And so I think our employers, our educators, this uniquely human philosophy, the more that it expands, the more that it gets proven true. And I think educators, employers, professionals are starting to see this. And I think another thing that in addition to permission and license that you're giving to parents and to individuals to say, like, you know best, you are the expert, we should be learning from you, you're also giving them language, which is interesting because you're an SLP. So you're giving them the language and the tools to be able to express what they know intuitively, but can now use the jargon and the parlance effectively in explaining what's going on.
Yes. And if I can give you a quick example of that, I'll never forget a number of years ago, a parent contacted me. This was before Uniquely Human, and said, Barry, I heard you speak, and you spoke about when a child might have a meltdown or a child might be screaming. And you said, that is a display, a behavioral manifestation of the child's emotional dysregulation. And what the mom said to me was in a letter, she said to me, ever since that workshop, my 12-year-old son's school staff don't refer to him anymore as having bad behaviors. They talk about when he is dysregulated. And so they talk about the reason why he may, jump up and down and scream and run out of the classroom or do whatever he does. But the focus is on what are the triggers, what is his internal state and his feelings that are causing that behavior. And the mom said, this is so much more respectful. I got so sick and tired of people talking about my kid as problem behavior, is always a behavior problem. In other words, you're not defining the person by what you perceive as something that's challenging to you. You're trying to understand that person's experience by talking about the dysregulation they're experiencing.
That's exactly right. One of those terms is objective. One of those terms is subjective. Subjectivity leads, has connotations. It leads to misunderstandings. It leads to hurt feelings. Subjectivity can be damaging. Objectivity, you're in a state of regulation. You're in a state of dysregulation. It's not accusatory.
Right.
There's no value associated with it. It's binary, A or B.
And it's more solution oriented.
Right.
It's not that, okay, how do you stop the behavior? It's how do we change the factors and the circumstances that are causing the dysregulation?
That's right. And that's looking at the person, as an individual, and understanding their whole context.
Right. The uniquely human person. Yes.
As it were. So you're this young guy, and young guy from Brooklyn. The academic work of the day seriously conflicted with your own personal observations from spending time with these individuals, but also spending time with their families. Tell me a little bit more about how the families influenced you and your philosophy and your approaches to working with individuals with autism.
Yes, the families influenced me tremendously. I did my master's thesis on writing kind of a guidebook for parents on how to improve their children's communication skills. I was in a master's program in speech-language pathology, and I had the opportunity to interview many parents and meet many parents early on. One of my favorite stories is one of my mentors. And I need to say I had wonderful mentors who were not experts in autism, but who were experts in child development. And they gave me the foundation also. But one of my favorite stories is I went with one of my mentors, Dr. John Muma, and we were invited to give a little talk on language development and language disorders to one of the earliest chapters of the National Society for Autistic Children in Buffalo, New York. And that is one of the early chapters of what is now the Autism Society of America. They changed their name. And as we walked in and we were greeted by the president turned to Dr. Muma and said, Dr. Muma, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for coming and be willing to speak to our members. Barry, I understand you're a student of Dr. Muma's and that you're really studying autism. Thank you for coming. And let me just say that if you mention the name Bruno Bettelheim, we're going to kick you out on your asses.
They were not playing games.
So my first exposure, one of my first exposures in a formal way to meeting a whole group of parents was how they had been so disrespected And their experience and the experience of their kids had been so wrong in terms of how it was described in the literature by Bruno Bettelheim in particular, but also people in child psychiatry. And right away it was like, oh my goodness, these parents, what they must have to experience, or what they have experienced in the past, where people were pointing a finger directly at them and saying, your kid's autism is due to you because you did not know how to raise your child. You were emotionally cold to your child.
And that language evokes that there is a problem, and it assigns blame and fault.
That's correct. Yes. And then during my program, without getting too much into the weeds, I had the chance to work in a few different settings in the Buffalo, New York area, including a hospital setting. And I got to meet wonderful professionals and the parents of the children in those settings. And I became a part of, in Western New York, the autism community, and the wonderful community that included parents and professionals. Because I need to say that, when people say, oh, those were the dark ages and, nothing was going on right, nobody knew what autism was. I'm talking about 1972, 1973. I worked in a wonderful program, a day treatment program in Buffalo Children's Hospital with a wonderful teacher. The parents were fully embraced. We saw ourselves as a community. We had picnics together. We had cookouts together in the 2 months that you could have a cookout in Buffalo, New York. We had Christmas parties together. Yeah. And that sense of community still resonates with me to this day, the importance of developing communities of support and respect. And I see kids and families and adults doing best when we see those communities functioning well.
Well, I've had personal firsthand experience with your sense for community by attending your retreat. So you and your wife, Elaine, host every year a retreat for parents of individuals with autism, and and I got to go a few years ago, I think it was 2017, and just seeing all the parents that were there that year coming together and embracing one another, laughing, voicing intense frustrations that other people, even their own brothers and sisters and their families and their closest friends, couldn't possibly understand. But other parents from South Carolina or Washington State coming together at this annual retreat, it really, when you feel like you have a tribe and a community that you belong to, it goes right back to improved quality of life immediately.
Hands down, one of my greatest learning experiences in my career. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, we had to put off this year's retreat, but it would have been our 25th anniversary celebration.
Oh, really? 25 years.
25 years. Done hand in hand with the parents of Community Autism Resources, to be accurate, the parent professionals of Community Autism Resources, an agency of family support in Southeast Massachusetts that is recognized by the state of Massachusetts as a regional family support agency. And my wife is a professional in the field. She's a clinical psychologist and a nurse, and she and I could not ever dream of doing something like that by ourselves. It had to be hand in hand with parents. So every year, 50 to 60 parents and 2 professionals and many parent professionals get together in a beautiful woodland setting in central Rhode Island.
That's right.
And create a place where parents don't have to explain themselves. Create a place where they could tell what in mainstream public would be a very strange story about something their child had done. But in this setting, everybody gets it. Everybody laughs along, or everybody hugs each other and says, I know, we've experienced that too. So it's just a wonderful time of shared experience, but also new friendships that go well beyond the retreat. We have dads groups that started out of the retreat. We have a Facebook page where parents communicate with each other all year long. That sense of community is critical, is essential. There's a person or people you can go to under any circumstance, and they get it.
And they get it. That's exactly right. You really can't do better than having a tribe of people who get it. Now, you have used a phrase that autism is a shared human experience.
Yes, and let me give credit where credit's due. The specific term shared human experience came out of a review that Carol Gray, and most people will recognize Carol Gray as the incredibly creative, important educator in the field of autism who invented social stories, comic book conversations, and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carol read the book, and she basically said, finally, with Uniquely Human, we now see autism as a shared human experience.
Oh, my.
Yeah. And where that comes from in terms of my experience is the importance of reflecting back on how we all change for the better in many cases, but we also see some of our shortcomings in terms of, our patience, our acceptance of maybe a child doing something that in mainstream public, people would say, oh, you got to stop him. And you might feel, if you know the child well, what's the big deal? I mean, he's jumping up and down, flapping his hands. What's the,
right.
What's the big? I mean, he's looking pretty happy to me right now. So, I think people who benefit the most from the experience of having children or adults with autism in their lives are the ones who are constantly reflecting back on themselves as an evolving human being.
In what way?
In saying, now, wait a second. Am I being judgmental of these parents? Am I being judgmental of this child? Do I appreciate and really feel gratitude to have this child and family in my life? Because, let's say for professionals now, I have a job that I love and I think about all the time. I have a job that makes me feel that I've become a better human being based upon what I do. I'm not going into an office and punching numbers out to make somebody else wealthy.
Right.
I'm doing something that is part of my journey. And that's that shared human experience piece. That it's part of each of our personal journeys. And the people who leave the field either work in such terrible settings that they can't see that in a positive way, or they just, for whatever reason, I'm not being judgmental here, they decide, I don't want this to be my journey. I want to work in a job where my workday ends at 3 or 5 o'clock, and then I could go out and go to a bar every night and listen to music and not have to think about work.
So as an extension of that came a book titled Uniquely Human. And this is the book that they turn the last page and they say, I want more. Like, what? Give me this guy's phone number. I'm going to go back and read it again, sometimes 5 times, where people memorize it. But they absolutely want more. And I'm going to buck my my social filter and my social programming here and go rogue on you, because I know you hate being flattered, and I know you hate when people say laudatory things when they're praising you and your work. So I'm going to share some things, reactions to Uniquely Human, the book, from moms and dads, and then maybe from some professionals. So there was a mother who had shared with you that as a parent who is waiting for the official ASD diagnosis and trying to not fall into a downward spiral of anxiety and worry for my child, all I can say is that I am so happy that I purchased this book. I've only read up to the 2nd chapter, but I've cried happy tears twice. Twice was that moved by the 2 chapters in. And then she goes on, I'm thinking of buying copies for my immediate family members to help them understand what my child is going through. Now, that was from a mom, and fathers, too, are really embracing what you mean by uniquely human. So there's a dad who wrote it, and I'll keep going all day, so get comfortable. A dad had written, I wish I had read this book first. It was so helpful to me as a parent of a recently diagnosed autistic child. My kid is not broken or in need of a cure. He just needs to be understood, supported, and loved. I can do that. And I can do that with an exclamation point. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. So there's only about, 100, 200 these types of things that people have publicly expressed. What other reactions have you been getting to readers of the book or people who have come and heard you talk?
Yes, that's been incredibly, validating for me, that it's come from so many different quarters and so many different people. When people say, or sometimes I'm asked, what is the reaction that you most cherish? And what I usually say is the reactions that come from parents and autistic people, because parents and autistic people are in a position to kind of validate what I'm saying. Is what I'm saying true? Is it meaningful? And so one of my favorite quotes is from a man I actually met at a conference, and a self-advocate on the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And he wrote to me and he said, reading Uniquely Human was like stepping onto a sunlit balcony overlooking the ocean and breathing in an abundance of fresh, invigorating air. He gets it. He gets it. Barry is one of the few neurotypicals who truly understands the autistic mind. Many, many times as I read the book, I found myself saying yes, yes to his insight and his approach. And on a very simple level, what that says to me is, okay, I guess I'm somewhat accurate. It's incredibly humbling because, the history of autism, as we all know, is for so many years, professionals guessed at what the experience of autism was. Even though people might have been doing, research funded by millions of dollars of federal funds, they were still guessing from a neurotypical perspective in interpreting that research to say, oh, well, this is what autism is. So comments such as that, is just are the comments that make me feel like, okay, Barry, you're on track here, and that's more than on track, is that what you are doing is meaningful in the lives of autistic people, in the lives of parents. Now, when educators and therapists say this is valuable, I learned a number of strategies or techniques, or I've been trained in this approach and I never felt comfortable. And I'm just going to put it right up front. I get a lot of comments and notes from people who are trained in behavior analysis, some of whom have their BCBAs, and of course, there's a wide range of practice even under that category. But people who say to me, I've never understood why I felt uncomfortable in doing this prescriptive programming where I needed to control the child's behavior. And now after reading Uniquely Human, I get why. Because I wanted to develop a trusting, secure relationship with this child and make sure that they were happy and they loved the time they were spending with me. And the approach I was trained in did not allow me to go there.
That's why I think all of this is just so vitally important, is that we have voices from every possible corner, from every possible background, joining the conversation. And one thing I will point out too, I'm just going to call it right on the head. The top two books, yes, were written by neurotypicals, and to me, as a comedian, that's hilarious. But I'm going to get completely flamed by our listeners on that remark, but it's funny to me. But they were also written by two white guys.
Yes.
So
yes.
There's a little bit of tricky territory when it comes to things like privilege, in the sense that if you're born in America, you're a white and a male, I can't imagine more privilege than that, other than maybe being royalty or a celebrity. What I'm excited to do is I want to be able to use the podcast series as an opportunity for people to bring their voices in wherever they're from, and especially women on the spectrum, and explaining from where they're coming from, because you can dice human beings up only about a billion different ways, but a woman's experience on the spectrum is absolutely going to be different in some ways from a man's, just because women and men have different experiences, right? In our society right now. So whether it's somebody really well known like Becca Laurie, I'm excited to have people like that on who a lot of people would know their name, and then people who haven't been out there writing books, blogs, making videos or anything, just living their life, and I want to bring them on too. I think people of color. I think when we say, "Oh yeah, I work with this guy, he's autistic," we almost never, at least in my experience, people never paint that sort of avatar in their mind as a young black man or a Mexican girl. I want to be able to represent on this series the full color spectrum, the full gender spectrum, sexual identity, age, everything. And I think this will give us a great opportunity to do that, because you happen to know only about 20% of the Earth's population by now. Like, and I can mention her name to almost anybody, and they're like, "Oh, I love him." I'm excited for all the wonderful people we're going to be able to talk with. So, tell you what, we could do this for way too long. I've got a dumpster arriving in 10 minutes. So
yes, real life here on our podcast.
No, here's the thing. I want to build a community around this, and you do too. I know this about you, is that you and I both want listeners to be submitting topics that they want to learn more about. They want to ask us questions. I think it's really important that our listeners engage in saying what they feel like their school district is doing wrong, what they feel like the district is doing right. I want our listeners to tactfully and responsibly call BS on things that we say that they don't agree with. And then share your stories with us. I want listeners to be able to say, listen, nobody else will get this, but you guys will. We were in the mall. and we're toilet training our youngster. And wouldn't you know it, there's a toilet on display on the sales floor at Sears. Can you believe what happened next? We want to know we want to hear these wonderful stories, because I think that's how people can really access the autistic experience, is by listening to those with the experience voice it for themselves.
We would love to hear those stories, because we will continue, Dave and I will continue to learn by hearing your stories. And that's what's so important. And also that's what's lost in our culture. We think data, but many other cultures really value stories as a way to learn much more than our culture does.
That's interesting. We'll have the website, uniquelyhuman.com, where you can go on, you can obviously listen to the episodes, you can read the notes and things, and that's where you can drop comments and ask questions, share stories, that sort of thing. We've also got Facebook page, facebook.com/uniquelyhumanpodcast. People can go on there and, what do you want to hear about? Just write it in there. And let's start building this community, because this podcast, yes, it's hosted by us, but it's not about you and me. It's about the community. So let's do a quick thing. This was your idea. I think we both know that if we were leaving it up to either one of us, we would end a podcast just the way we end a phone call, which is to say, like, all right, well, I've said what I wanted to, bye, click, and that's it. Like, I think it would be a very abrupt ending, but you had the insight to say, we're going to be covering a lot of topics, and I think it would be good at the end of every episode if we just summarize for people what the hell it was we were talking about. And I agreed. So give me your takeaway from this first episode for you, what are the key takeaways? What do you want the listeners to have absorbed today? And what do you want them to look forward to in the next few episodes?
Yes, well, what I would really love is if listeners could think deeply about the term uniquely human, not as just the title of a book that we wrote, but also as a different way of understanding people with a spectrum diagnosis, but even the greater neurodiverse world of people, and what that does, what that changes by moving away from the lens of pathology, by looking at people as we really are, and that we are very complex with our own strengths and our own challenges. And what we hope the podcast will do is that will open up just an incredible range of topics and discussions that will be an additional support for us to move through this revolution and this tsunami of change that we are experiencing now.
I love it. And my big takeaway is don't rent a dumpster when you know you have other professional obligations going on. So we'll tackle all of these topics, certainly, and more. Very much looking forward to joining you again for our second episode.
Yes.
And, like we said, go to uniquelyhuman.com, go to facebook.com/uniquelyhumanpodcast and the other social media pages to just drop us some comments and ask us questions. Definitely want to hear your stories. We want to understand your questions, and we want you to voice your concerns too. So with that, Barry, any parting thoughts?
Just that I feel incredibly grateful to be working with you, Dave, and also very grateful for those of you who have chosen to spend this time with us, and we hope you join us in the future. We think it'll be worthwhile.
I think so too. Yeah, and the honor is all mine. I'm the price of admission. Barry's the steak, I'm the sizzle. All right, cool. Thanks everybody for listening.
All right, thank you.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.